There's two types of gradients in CSS3, linear and radial. Gradients can be made using different color modes. You can use color names like red and blue, or hexadecimal values like £FFF or £CCC. You can even create gradients using the RGBA color mode, which stands for red, green, blue, and alpha. That allows you to create gradients with opacity. Gradients normally go from one color to another, but you can add an infinite amount of color stops within your gradients. You can even add more than one gradient or a gradient and an image to an element. Let's take a look at how that comes together. I've created a series of boxes right here that will hold my gradients, and I'm going to apply a different gradient to each one of these different boxes. I have the CSS prepared over here to start coding my gradient. So I'm going to start with the linear gradient first. You have to be really careful when you type the code for gradients because it's very picky about the spacing of where everything goes. So to put in a gradient, we'll start with the background image keyword here. And as the background image, instead of putting in a URL for an image, we're going to put in a WebKit gradient. The next thing we need to do is specify the type of gradient that this is going to be. This will be a linear gradient. The next thing is to specify the direction of the gradient. It's specified in a positioning that has two coordinates, and the coordinate system is a little bit weird. You start in from the left top, say, to the right bottom, with the side first and the up or down position next, separated by commas. After that, you specify the beginning color of the gradient. Make sure you don't put a space after the keyword from. And then you specify the ending color of the gradient. And then you close in your WebKit gradient. Notice that there's two parentheses over here. This ending parentheses here matches this beginning parenthesis that goes with WebKit gradient. So let's just review what we did. We created a gradient. It's a linear gradient. Goes from the left top to the right bottom. We can, of course, change those to go from the left bottom, right? That makes a horizontal gradient to the right bottom if we make these the same. If we wanted to make a vertical gradient, then we could do left top to left bottom. Or we can specify diagonal positions like we did here. Then we specify where the gradient begins and where it ends. And you can use any color mode you want right here. All right, so let's do another gradient. This one will have a color stop. A color stop is when you want to have a gradient with more than two colors. So we'll begin again with the background image and WebKit gradient. And it's also a good idea to add your parentheses at the same time. So I'm going to type in the beginning and the ending parenthesis for the WebKit gradient right here. And then this will also be a linear gradient from the left top to right bottom. It's going to go from red. And that looks like a normal gradient. If we want to add an additional color, we put in a color stop, and we can add any number of color stops in the gradient. We'll just add a comma and type in the keyword here, color stop, and then put in where the color is going to stop or begin. So we'll put in 0.5, and then we'll specify what the color is going to be at that stop. So we told the gradient that at 50% or 0.5 of its position, add a color stop of green. So now the gradient is going to go from the red to the green in the center, and from the green to the yellow, which is its ending position right here. So it creates these three-step gradient. You can keep on adding as many color stops as you want. Now let's create a gradient that also has an image in the same definition. Okay, this gradient uses an RGBA color. RGBA allows you to specify a number for each one of the channels, a number for the red channel, a number for the green channel, and a number for the blue channel, as well as an alpha or transparency number. Putting a 0.9 here means this gradient is 90% opaque. Okay, so we have our basic gradient there, and we're going to add a second element, which is going to be an image. All right, so as you can see, The gradient is applied on top of the image, and because the gradient itself has a bit of transparency, you can see the image behind the gradient. Okay, the last type of gradient we're going to work with is a radial gradient. Radial gradients are a little bit different. So we'll start off by using background image and start off the same way, WebKit. Instead of specifying linear, here we'll specify radial. And with radial gradients, what you're going to be doing is specifying essentially two circles and their position within the box element. So as you can see here, I've created a gradient that is positioned in the center, where the gradient begins in the middle of the box, and it goes to another circle that is also at the center, but is a lot bigger. So if I change these values around, you'll see my gradient will get bigger and smaller. You can position the circles that make up the gradient in different places. So if I move this first circle to the left, it moves the beginning of the gradient to the left. So by putting in 50%, 50%, here I've centered the gradient in the middle, but I can move it around by changing these values. And I can also change the size of the circles by using this third value right here. The notation is a little bit weird because there's commas kind of all over the place, but it makes sense once you understand how these different values can modify the gradient. Gradients are just another tool in CSS that allow you to create complex graphics with simple code. Two simple gradient types and the ability to layer multiple gradients with transparency and color styles give you incredible flexibility.